Good morning again, everyone. Ness here with you for day 4 of our daily devotionals, where we're going to attack another big chunk of the text today from the book of Exodus, looking at chapter 11 all the way through to chapter 15. We begin with chapter 11 at the climax of the 10th and final plague, reading now from verse 4. So Moses said, "This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again." We would do well to remember as we read this what was decreed in chapter 1 by Pharaoh. We looked at it on day 1. Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every slave girl live." As we sit this against the 10th plague in chapter 11, those verses we just read, we realise quickly that God's mighty acts have been a great reversal of the terrible oppression and plight that God's people had experienced. It doesn't make it any easier to accept that God would be involved in such savage and extreme acts of death and judgment, but it is the context of the Exodus and the plague narratives. We would also do well to remember that for the ultimate rescue plan of all people, God does indeed involve death again, and this time death of his own firstborn son, Jesus, the Son of God. Well, that leads us to consider chapter 12, where the first Passover occurs and the notion of being covered by sacrificial blood in order to be spared from death is experienced by God's people. Let's read now from chapter 12, verses 1 through to 13. "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, 'This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbour, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." Now, before we gloss over these verses and say, this is the foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus, where you would be quite right, let's slow down and remember that sacrifice and blood atonement was actually already a familiar practice for the people of God. That life and blood are closely understood, and the idea that the sacrifice of another is an acceptable alternate offering was already well and truly understood. The blood on their door frames, offered by a sacrificial lamb, spares them, and they understand that. Spares them from what? God's judgment. Read verse 12 again. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So this final plague isn't just trying to exhaust Pharaoh's stubborn heart. It's not just a diversion while the people make a run for it. It's the judgment of God. God will judge their persistent worship of Egyptian gods and save his people in the one act. God alone is to be worshipped. He alone has the power, and he will judge a defiant world. But he will also save, and has the power to save, and is faithful to his promise to rescue. These should be two aspects of God's nature that we hold together and be remembered. In fact, God instructs them to indeed remember these things. He says in verse 14, "This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." Remember, Exodus was written in hindsight. It wasn't written as a running log at the time, but written as they would have already experienced many years of observing the Passover meal, their yearly festival, where they did indeed come together to remember both God's judgment and salvation. The Passover meal as a sign of God's faithfulness to his covenant, celebrated, and God was worshipped. They record God's mighty power to save, and he did indeed save them. This is how it unfolded in chapter 12, verse 9. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go, worship the Lord as you have requested." And so God's people were set free. Let me read now from the end of chapter 13, where God's people now sit on the edge of the desert, freed from Pharaoh, but not without challenges yet ahead. It says, "By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people." Now I hope it jumps out to you straight away that the signs of God's presence are here: fire and clouds. Remember, these aren't symbols for God, but signs of his actual presence. I will be with you, God had promised, and he is. All of those difficult verses to read about the Passover and the final plague are all about this, that God has rescued his people and he is with them. Now, it seems criminal for me to whiz past the parting of the Red Sea, a wonderful and definitive moment in the scheme of God's rescue. I will let you read the full account of that on your own. But today, just let me finish with these verses from chapter 14. This is a moment where the Egyptians were chasing the Israelites as they fled, and they stand between their enemy and a wall of water. And Moses says to them, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. And so I'll leave that as an encouragement for you today. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord has delivered you. The Lord is with you. You need only be still.